Welcome to Orchid's Odysseys, and this will be Rescue to Recovery by KingofPillows on AO3. Please make sure to check out the author in the description, and I hope you enjoy. Summary. Izuku Midoriya had always wanted to be a hero, and that dream shriveled up and died the moment his father stepped back into his life. But now, Hizashi and every evil thing that man built is gone. His name out for the media to slash to their liking, a long list of sins finally closed. And a life he thought he had thrown away suddenly under his control. Izuku now finds himself standing in the aftermath, holding on to that dream again. And, with the people dedicated to helping him recover from every wrong thing he's done, he might just make it real. Chapter 1. For the first time in forever. The day Izuku was discharged from the hospital felt like the first day he'd ever really been outside, given hand-me-down jeans, shirt, and jacket from Aizawa's son Shinsou. Most of the bandaging he was sporting earlier was thankfully gone, leaving his only remaining issue to be a slow-to-heal shoulder. That didn't take the full healing effect as it should have. It would be a minor inconvenience until it fixed on its own. Izuku could handle it. Izuku walked out the front doors by Aizawa into a decent March day. Almost noon. Sun bright and warm, and a chill in the air. The world felt lighter. It was a strange feeling, especially being out without a hood to hide his hair. Without it, he just felt exposed to everything. Out in the open with no reason to hide or disappear. Right outside the hospital was Inko. She greeted Aizawa warmly and drew Izuku into a brief hug, letting him go and smiling happily at him as Aizawa started speaking. "So you agreed to the housing arrangement?" he asked. Inko nodded with a soft yet reserved smile. "Yes, I talked to Toshi about it, and we both agreed it was the best," she answered with a sigh, crossing one arm under her chest and putting a cheek in her other hand as she did so. Her tone was something akin to begrudgingly accepting terms put out for her. "Housing?" Izuku asked quietly. He was looking between the two curiously. Aizawa looked at him with soft comfort on his face. Not exactly a smile, but it was there. "We've talked and agreed that you'll be switching between Inko's home and my apartment every week, purely for your own health." Izuku's face scrunched in question. What in the world does switching houses have to do with his health? He'd much rather just stay with his mom to make sure she was safe. Aizawa seemed to catch on to his thoughts. "It's to keep track of improvements and how you're adjusting. You'll see your mother regularly, while Yamada and I can help out where need be. It's only until you've adjusted out and living out here after everything that's happened, and we can make sure you don't get hurt in the process." Izuku raised his eyebrow, and shifted weight to his other foot. At least he was getting to see his mother regularly. Maybe this housing situation was part of the program? It makes sense. "So you'll be starting with me." Izuku looked between the two. He really wanted to stay with his mom. He hadn't seen her in so long, aside from the hospital visits, and he could tell the situation pained both adults. Maybe because they both knew who he'd want to stay with if given the choice. But if there wasn't space for him yet, he understood. "Wait. R?" Izuku asked, almost hesitantly. Inko brightened. "Oh! I married a few years ago to Toshinori. You'll meet him when you stay. I think you two would get along. He's currently at work." Aizawa rolled his eyes. It wasn't annoyed or sarcastic, but more knowing. Why did he? What did he know? Izuku's mind flashed back to photos Hizashi used as a threat. A tall blonde man walking with Inko. A bright smile on her face when the two were clearly talking. Maybe that was Toshinori. Inko certainly looked happy when she talking about him. He couldn't be so bad if he made her happy, right? Thoughts of his new stepdad were shaken off as the three started walking down the street. Apparently a lunch was in order. For cheap food. Real food. It was good. Inko talked about things Izuku was happy to listen to. Common life that he had missed out on, but not overwhelming him with too many things. Her work, Bakugo Mitsuki, an old friend Izuku knew at one point, Toshinori, things like that. When it was time to part ways, Inko gave a soft and oddly comforting farewell and a tight hug. making sure Aizawa had her phone number as a just-in-case before she left for a shift at her work, almost seeming to tear herself away. Izuku and Aizawa watched her walk away until the crowd swallowed her. Aizawa assured Izuku that she was safe. Under watch by local heroes, he trusted Aizawa not to lie to him about something so important to him like his mother. Tests, Izuku said flatly as they got off the train. Working through the crowd, headed for the hero's apartment. Aizawa shrugged with his hands in his jean pocket. They won't take long. New term starts in the middle of April. It's almost the middle of March. We have to make sure you're up to bat academically. Program or not, your grades are important, and you have to keep up with your peers. Considering yourself lucky that you only have to take the recommended student's evaluation. Aizawa watched Izuku, looking both annoyed and interested, mulling over the new information. Since he got off the painkillers, his expressions got harder to read, but the interest was clear as day. So, what else am I required to do for this? Therapy, for one. We already talked to the doctor about the physical. Mental therapy. Izuku scrunched his nose at this. There's a teacher on campus, Hound Dog, who's qualified and licensed to practice. He's a counselor for many students, and he's agreed to be part of the program to help you. Izuku stuffed his hands in his jacket pocket and glanced away. There was discomfort in his face, but there wasn't anything Aizawa could really do about it. Requirements were requirements. It's required, Izuku. No skipping. Fine. It didn't sound moody or resistant, but more hesitant about the idea of opening up to someone he didn't know. Aizawa had faith in his co-worker to do his job and help the kid, and probably not be as loud as he normally would be any other time. Aizawa reached in and hooked his arm under the would-be escape artist, pushing the door open and pulling the cat closer to his chest. Izuku blinked. A cat? We have 3. Aizawa gestured for Izuku to walk inside first, and he did, suddenly looking more and more nervous. The other 2 cats weren't as social as the tin tabby, Maron, trying to climb up to Aizawa's shoulder as he walked inside and shut the front door. Izuku was awkwardly standing as Aizawa slipped out of his shoes and dropped the cat onto the ground. You have a pair there. Aizawa gestured to a pair of slippers as he stepped on the step. Izuku knelt down and started to untie his shoes and put the slippers on. As he did, Aizawa pulled his keys from his pocket and dropped them in the catch bowl on the thin hall table. He found Hitoshi's house keys, stuck on an old UA lanyard, and paired with keychains, he already there. Izuku was standing wordlessly as Maron... Side note, I can't tell if it's Maron or Maroon or Moron. I'm gonna say Maron. As Maron wrapped around his legs and meowed for attention. That's Maron. Fluffball and Reo are probably in Shinsou's room. Fluffball? Izuku echoed with a quiet snort right after. Aizawa caught the tail end of the amusement at his smile, before the kid knelt down and let Maron sniff his hand. I didn't name him. Aizawa, with Izuku cautiously following along, gave Izuku the basic layout of the apartment. To the exact left, once the hall was at the kitchen doorway, the hall made a right a few feet ahead that led to another hall. The guest room at the direct end, bathroom on the right, and Hitoshi's room on the left. Right after the kitchen, the place opened up to the living room and a dining table. Farther left was the master bedroom, and a bathroom. The apartment wasn't small, but it wasn't too big. It was meant to house a small family. Aizawa showed Izuku where he'd be staying. The guest room was converted from a temporary use and a storage room to the kids' room. Cardboard boxes unable to be moved were stacked in the closet to take up less space. The room was small, but nothing small like that prison cell in their base. The walls were a normal tan, the window not small, but not the biggest he'd ever seen. The sill white, framed by dark blue curtains, and the ceiling flat. The bed was a regular twin and pushed into the corner. The foot of the bed under the window. Dark blue blankets over it, and a single gray pillow on top. An old desk placed to the immediate left, with an old rolling chair pushed in. The tearaway calendar sitting on it to show the dates. Something to help with time passing. Pushed against the wall and facing the end of the bed was a tall plain dresser. A dress filled with some of Hitoshi's older clothes that they had been planning on donating a while ago, and never got around to it. Newly washed and put away, so Izuku had something to wear until he could be spared for properly getting clothes. On top, sitting as neat as a row as Hizashi could manage, were unmarked empty notebooks. Right beside the closet, which stood in the far corner in the right wall, straight from the door, was a tall mirror, unhooked to the wall and just leaning against it. It was plain, and the furniture was old to a degree, but it needed redecorating to fit the teenager's style. But it was the best they could offer without completely overwhelming the kid. Izuku had walked into the room and looked it over while Aizawa waited in the doorway, leaning in the frame with his arms crossed to gauge the kid's reaction. Hitoshi's door right beside him was closed. He was probably studying for the exam next week in his headphones in. Izuku was looking at the notebooks, and now took to staring at the window, which was cracked slightly to air it out after cleaning it the other day. "You good, kid?" Izuku turned to face him. Eyes stayed on the window a second longer as he moved. His head tilted, and wearing an expression Aizawa couldn't read too well. Yeah. Aizawa made a humming sound and went to say something when he heard mumbling, and a sleepy-eyed Hitoshi Shinsou. Headphones sitting around his neck, playing soft music. The two cats that were stuck in his room darted out. Rio, now in a white blur, raced down the hallway and into the living room. The gray fluff ball ran into Izuku's room and leapt onto the bed, curling in the patch of sunlight, hitting the end of it. "Hey, Dad," Hitoshi greeted while opening the door wider. Then the teen's eyes targeted the open guest door. The open guest door really only meant one thing: that Izuku kid was finally here. They had spent the whole day moving things around to accommodate someone for more than just a weekend, and no one else had business being in there afterwards. Shouta and Hizashi had sat him down just 3 days ago, and proposed the idea of housing Izuku every other week. Adjustment, they said. Only until he properly adjusts to everything, it's safe. That's the thing they pushed the most. Izuku, the rabbit, as the media had titled him, wasn't a threat. It was laughable, but there wasn't much in the way of arguing against it. Shouta was clearly attached. It was in his eyes, and Hitoshi could relate to Izuku in that one way. So, a chance was in order, if Shouta was willing to temporarily house a villain, former or not. That didn't mean he couldn't be somewhat reluctant about it, though. Was the only thing Hitoshi could say. It didn't sound distasteful to him, but the downward pull of Shota's lips was a telltale sign that the hero could tell Hitoshi's opinion without him having to say it. "Izuku," Shouta said with a glance in the room. A quick, "come here" gesture with his head later. And Hitoshi got a look at the rabbit without his mask. It was a kid his age, shorter and thinner, dwarfed in that old jacket. But other than that, Hitoshi was taken aback a bit. The scars on his face, the one on his neck and falling under the neckline of his shirt, looked odd. Hands stuffed in his pocket, and a mess of dark green, curly hair falling in his face, over tired green eyes and a mess of freckles. "This is Hitoshi, my son." Izuku glanced from Shouta to Hitoshi with a flat expression, scanning Hitoshi up and down like he had done to Izuku a second before. He gave a wordless nod as a greeting. Hitoshi put his hands in his pockets and nodded back. A phone rang, startling the short silence. Shouta pulled his phone and sighed, and said something about Nezu before turning and walking further into the apartment to talk. leaving Izuku and Hitoshi on their own. The meeting was, by far, very awkward, but Hizashi asked for him to at least try to find common ground, so he'd honor that simple request and talk to someone who clearly shared his discomfort. So, Hitoshi started. Rehab, huh? Izuku nodded. That's what they're calling it. Izuku glanced down at Hitoshi's shirt. It was an old UA one he stole from Shouta. Are you a student? I'm studying for the entrance exam. Izuku's eyes seemed to brighten at this. Something akin to astonishment? Something like that. His demeanor relaxed slightly. What's your quirk? Izuku asked, his voice slightly higher level than before. Hitoshi raised an eyebrow. Mind control. Hitoshi was expecting a negative reaction, much like the ones he'd gotten before his dad's ever found him, and the ones he still got in school. Instead, Izuku's eyes only brightened even more. That's so cool! Was what really threw Hitoshi off. It's practical in the field. You could defuse hostage situations, or make someone turn themselves in, or even help in interrogations, if your quirk allows it. The boy devolved into muttering as a thought swam over his face, his hands out of his pockets and wringing themselves as if it was itching to do something. Right, maybe? He didn't miss the lines over his hands. Hitoshi only stared at his face, screwed up in thought. Izuku must have caught on to this, because he stopped talking immediately, and any sort of excitement faded just as quick. Looking nervous again, mumbling an apology. You don't think it's, villainous? Of all people, Hitoshi somehow thought the villain would think of it that way. Not immediately fire off good uses of it. Though it was definitely an appreciated rant. Izuku's head tilted, and his voice was now soft again. I don't think quirks can be bad unless you, make them. There was something else implied with make them that Hitoshi wasn't catching, but there was some sort of guilt in his eyes. That was one thing he could read easily. Aizawa looked back into the hallway to see Izuku looking somewhat guilty and serious, with Hitoshi looking off-put. Izuku staring like he just said something somewhat intense and waiting for a response. The other boy not really knowing how. I'm gonna go study, Hitoshi said after a few moments. The boy's door closed and Izuku looked puzzled. Aizawa watched Izuku glancing around, catch Aizawa nod to him, and close the door to settle in. Then he got back to his conversation with Nezu, coordinating test dates. Izuku closed the door softly and turned to face the rest of his room. Left alone, aside from the cat sleeping on the end of the bed, and not really knowing what to do now. He stared at the cat and his thoughts went over everything. Hitoshi. Shinsou. Hitoshi. He didn't seem like a bad kid. He was taller and probably on the quiet side. But he didn't really seem to like Izuku's reaction to his quirk. Or was he uncomfortable? He looked really tired, though. It looked so much like Aizawa that it was surprising. Was Hitoshi his biological child? No, the eyes and hair were wrong. Either way, Aizawa wasn't lying about having a family. This was already proven true because Yamada and Tensei both talked about Shinsou before. And Yamada was married. Though his purpose of being in the dire was a lie. Thankfully, a lie, he thought. Was it bad for him to say that it made his final decision feel right? Someone was bound to be angry with him if he said it out loud, but... Izuku shook his head and looked around again. He spotted the mirror and decided that with the bandages off, he could assess the damage. He took a hesitant steps towards it until he stood before the glass. He looked exhausted. Hair a mess, a few new scars compared to the last time he looked in the mirror. His left jawline, over his nose, 2 through his right eyebrow. The one on the end longer, it was the new one. The cut under his left eye and the temple above it had faded traces of one too. every scar he could see, and he survived 9 years of hell. He still didn't believe it. It didn't feel like 9. It felt longer. He didn't feel 15. He felt older. So much older. Izuku frowned and took off his jacket, letting it fall to the floor. As he looked over his arms, his scarred left hand, the lines crisscrossing over his fingers, gashing and scratching over it, the patchwork messy of old skin and new burns, reds, pinks, browns, mixed with white lines and barely any uninjured skin on that side. The burn crawled up to his neck, over the neckline of his shirt. The shirt he hesitantly took off and left hang in his right hand. His chest was a mess. The left side burnt too. Over his left shoulder and across his chest, though. The right wasn't as extensive as his arm. If there was too much damage there, he couldn't write out those analyses. He couldn't be as proficient with a weapon if his dominant hand wasn't working, right? The right side of his neck had two tiny little marks, the prongs from a shock box, the center of electrical lines scattered throughout them. Then he prepared himself for what he knew his back was decorated with. At that time, he forgot about it. He was too focused on the pain being caused rather than their stupid tradition. He knew what was there, but was still unprepared. He turned around and then craned his neck to look in the mirror at what was there. More burns, some new, most so old and fading, some old and fading. Ancient lines and gashes became the backdrop to the newer masterpiece. Korra and Yukio had healed and hurt him enough to permanently remind him. Lines across each other to the frame and the 4 characters carved down from his shoulder blades, just below the middle of his back. Traitor. Izuku reached back and gently touched the top character, feeling Rei's skin for a moment before frowning. It was real. He was real. But standing in a pro's apartment, in clothes that weren't his, in a bedroom with a flat ceiling, he didn't feel like it was actually true. He stared for another few minutes before he felt sick just looking at it, and pulled his shirt back on. The thing on the bed moved and caught his attention instead. It was the cat, lifting their head and yawning wide before staring Izuku down with bright yellow eyes. Curiously, Izuku crossed the room and sat on the floor next to the cat, holding his hand out for the cat to sniff and then rub their head on. The collar read fluff ball. A bell rang as it hit the small metal tag. Izuku smiled as he pet the fluff. Hiya, he ate quietly, bending his arm to rest on the top of the bed, and letting his cheek rest upon it as he scratched behind Fluffball's ear. The cat purring and flipping to lay on her back, head in his hand. You're cute. Izuku smiled as the cat switched from cute to biting his hand, going from complacent to playful in the seconds that Izuku was smiling and playing along. Izuku? Hizashi had called from the kitchen around 6 o'clock that evening. A door opened down the hall, and Hizashi didn't even hear the kid's footsteps, but he was suddenly in the doorway. Fluffball, the great traitor, curled in his arms while the boy just stared. Hizashi smiled at him. Want to help with dinner? Izuku looked at the counter Azushi was standing at, the small one that separated the living area and the kitchen. Plastic bags scattered over it, holding the ingredients that were the night's dinner, and the plastic cutting board and the knife Hizashi was standing in over. There were cabinets above the long stretch of missing wall, acting as a sort of window. The boy silently nodded, put Fluffball down, where she rolled over on her back, and begged for more attention, and walked over. Hands, Hizashi reminded before going to finish the pepper he was cutting. Izuku disappeared, the sink ran, and he walked back over with a rag to dry for a few minutes later. Just as Hizashi set down the cutting knife. We're making curry. We're making curry. That all right? Izuku silently nodded. Think you could take over cutting for me? Hizashi looked over with a comforting look. Hopefully it conveyed to Izuku that he had the full right to say no. It was all right if he wanted to go to watch or go back to his room until it was done. Hizashi looked between the cutting board and Hizashi's hand before slowly nodding. Hizashi smiled and stepped aside to get the pot from the cupboard. To get a pot from the cupboard. Getting various things from the fridge and getting it set up on the stove. When he had everything for the rice cooker up and set for when he needed it, he glanced back at Izuku. The boy was completely frozen, his right hand, with the one with the knife, shaking. What the heck am I supposed to do? Was the only thing running repeatedly through Izuku's head as he stared at the bell pepper under his left hand and the shaking knife in his right. Why did he agree to this? He didn't know how to cook pasta, let alone cut up peppers. He could do it, but what if he did it wrong? He'd probably piss someone off. Yamada might not really care, but what if he did? Should he just admit that he doesn't know how? Is that acceptable? Can he just openly admit he knows nothing? It's his job to... Need help, listener? Yamada snapped Izuku from his thoughts and jumped slightly. Focus on your surroundings more. Izuku looked at the knife and nodded quietly, refusing to look at the hero's face. Yamada went to get a different cutting board and a new knife, setting it up beside Izuku. Izuku intently watched Yamada cut up a different pepper, slowly and carefully. Izuku eventually taking up his own slow pace and mirroring the actions. It went like that for everything that he needed to be cut, until it was all done and divided out. Yamada smiled once the job was finished. Great job! Izuku's head tilted slightly at the praise, and he hesitantly smiled back, only getting Yamada to smile wider. Now! Izuku watched Yamada move around the kitchen, starting up the actual cooking. He looked around the quiet apartment. The TV was running as background noise. Where's Aizawa? Probably outside, training with Hitoshi. Izuku went quiet again and leaned back against the counter, arms crossed and not really knowing how to help or what to do with himself. He was uncomfortable. The hero's apartment was so domestic. No threat, a few cats. He spent the last few hours staring at the ceiling and petting a cat, not knowing what to do. There was nothing to do. Not sure how anyone would react to him Not sure how anyone would react to him taking up note-taking. Heroes again, so he didn't. Not sitting there waiting for the buzzing of his pager for a new job, or having to analyze a hero for a report to Hizashi. Not wondering if Hizashi would point out some mistake or broken rule and react. The anxiety of what to expect was so different from before. He didn't know what to expect. Couldn't know what to expect. It was, frankly, boring. He wasn't quite sure what to make of that discovery. What you thinking about, kiddo? Yamada said absently, unthreateningly. Open-ended and able to be shut down. Or was he just trying to talk because he was so quiet? Izuku stared at him and buried any sort of suspicious expression deep down. He didn't know Yamada as much as he knew Aizawa. Scratch that. He knew Aizawa only a little more than he did Yamada. But there was still that calm air that seemed to sit around him that most heroes he'd met out of compact. And it was the trusting air that led him to know where he was in the first place, wasn't it? Izuku's answer was only a shrug. Yamada didn't give him a look or any sort of disappointed tone. He only gave a humming reply to acknowledge the lack of response and let the silence sit again. Izuku was pretty sure he had some sort of thought about that reaction, but Fluffball biting his ankle pretty much stole it. Izuku smiled and moved to sit on the floor and pet her, ignoring the green eyes that glanced over to him ever so often between tasks. Katsuki didn't quite know how to react. These few sentences in the middle of story recaps, the same story that's been buzzing the media since the press got light of the release. The magazine in his hand, the article, now a few days old, reading back to him the source of his anger. He was shaking. He was shaking. The article covered the nationwide raids of gang bases. The Silver Dyer, over a week ago, and this one was talking about the high horses running their court, running their group and their air court sentences. Those bastards. The name of the boss, Hizashi, meant nothing to him. That bastard was distant memory. Midoriya mattered more. Izuku caused him the most trouble. The rabbit. That little. Katsuki threw the magazine across the room and it hit the wall. It was late. He couldn't go blowing things up unless he wanted that old hag to shout at him for waking her up. But Izuku, did Inko know that her son was that bad of a person? Katsuki remembered how upset Inko was when Hizashi got custody. She was devastated. She was when he was gone. How she only started recovering from it shortly before Toshinori. Izuku never even called her. Not once. And now he came back as a villain? A killer? Katsuki growled and ran his hands through his hair. He, unlike most every big shot in that group, had no known court date. No known punishment. Not even a stupid picture to out his existence to every person in Japan. You know what? He thought that stupid nerd didn't even need me thinking about him. He'd rot in prison before I ever see him in person anyway. And somehow, that line of self-comfort didn't feel like it was going to be true. And that's chapter 1. Thank you for listening, and thank you to KingofPillows on AO3 for letting me read this. If you noticed, I have a little bit of a stutter. I do have a little bit of a stutter, but for some reason, it's not acknowledged with my parents. I don't know. Thank you for reading. Or listening? Yeah, listening. And I hope you'll listen into the next chapter. Bye!